The summer heat pressed down on Thomas Blackwood's farmstead like a scorching iron, unrelenting and cruel. The fields of wheat stretched toward the horizon, golden waves under the merciless Nebraska sun of 1878. Thomas wiped sweat from his weathered brow, the lines on his face carved deep by 48 years of frontier living. 20 of those years had been spent on this land he'd fought for, bled for, buried a wife on. His calloused hands gripped the wooden handle of his hoe as he scanned the perimeter of his property for the third time that morning. The raid 2 months ago had left him vigilant, his sleep shallow, his nerves raw. The Pawnee had taken 3 of his horses and burned his storage shed. They hadn't taken lives that time, but Thomas knew frontier fortune was as fickle as the prairie winds. He turned toward the farmhouse, a sturdy 2-story structure of timber and determination, where Mary Beth, his housekeeper, was hanging laundry. The young woman had come west from Boston after losing her husband to pneumonia, answering Thomas's advertisement for help around the farm. For nearly a year, she'd kept his house in order, while he and his son, James, worked the land. "Mary Beth," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Best finish that washing quick. Storm clouds gathering to the west." But even as the words left his lips, he knew the distant dust clouds on the horizon weren't from any approaching storm. James appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, his 20-year-old frame tall and lean like his father's. "Pa," he said, his voice low and controlled, the way Thomas had taught him. "Riders coming. At least 6, maybe more." Thomas nodded, measuring the distance with his experienced eye. "Get inside. Tell Mary Beth to fetch the ammunition box from under my bed." The younger Blackwood moved without question, his boots kicking up dirt as he strode purposefully toward the house. Thomas followed more slowly, his mind calculating odds and options. The nearest neighbor, old Jebediah Miller, lived 4 miles east, and the town of Redemption Creek was a half-day's ride. Whatever was coming, they would face it alone. Inside the farmhouse, Mary Beth was already moving with quick efficiency, her blue dress swishing as she retrieved the wooden ammunition box from Thomas's room. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear and focused. At 25, she was no stranger to frontier dangers, having survived the arduous journey west and a year of Nebraska's unforgiving seasons. "How many?" she asked, her Boston accent still noticeable despite her time in the West. "James says 6, but I counted 8, Thomas replied, checking the loading mechanism on his Winchester rifle. "Could be Pawnee again. Could be Daniels and his boys from across the river. Either way, they ain't here for Sunday supper." James positioned himself at the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. "Pa, they're slowing at the creek crossing. I can make out they're not Pawnee. White men. One's wearing what looks like a cavalry hat, but it ain't no official patrol." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Cavalry hat meant either an ex-soldier or someone wanting to be mistaken for military. Neither boded well in these parts. Ex-soldiers often carried the war with them, their minds still battlefields long after the fighting had ceased. The Civil War had ended 13 years ago, but for some men, peace was harder to navigate than combat. "Mary Beth, take the Remington and go upstairs. If shooting starts, you fire out the north window. They'll think we have more guns than we do." She nodded, taking the shotgun with practiced hands. Boston-bred she might be, but Thomas had made sure she knew how to handle firearms within her first month on the farm. "What about Sarah?" Mary Beth asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as she mentioned Thomas's 14-year-old daughter. "She's still in the root cellar, gathering potatoes for supper." Thomas cursed under his breath. "James, fetch your sister, quick and quiet." As James slipped out the back door, Thomas took position by the front window, his weathered face grim as the riders came into clearer view. The men approached in a loose formation, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Thomas could now make out details: mismatched clothing, well-used saddles, rifles and pistols prominently displayed. The leader wore what was indeed an old cavalry hat, its once blue fabric faded to a nondescript grey. His beard was full, his posture suggesting authority born of violence rather than rank. Thomas recognized the type. Men who'd found lawlessness more profitable than rebuilding after the war, who roamed the territories taking what they wanted from those trying to carve out honest lives. The back door creaked open, and Thomas heard James's quick footsteps. "Sarah's not in the cellar, Pa. The basket's there, half filled with potatoes, but she's gone." The cold knot in Thomas's stomach tightened. Check the barn again, and the chicken coop. She might have heard them coming and hidden. James nodded and was gone again. Thomas returned his attention to the approaching riders, who had stopped about 50 yards from the house. The leader raised his hand in what might have appeared a friendly greeting to an unsuspecting eye, but Thomas saw the calculation behind the gesture. "Hello, the house," the man called, his voice carrying easily across the open yard. "We're looking for water and directions. Might you spare a few minutes for weary travelers?" The words were cordial, but the tone held an undercurrent that raised the hair on Thomas's neck. He'd heard such false civility before, from cotton traders in Texas who'd tried to cheat him, from land speculators in Kansas who'd threatened his first homestead, from raiders during the war who'd asked for quarter and then shot men in the back. "Your canteens look full from here," Thomas called back, not moving from his position inside, "and the main trail to Redemption Creek is clear enough. You've ridden past it about 3 miles back." The leader laughed, a sound without humor. "Sharp eyes you've got, mister, and a sharper tongue. We're not looking for trouble. Just some Christian charity." Thomas remained silent, watching as the men exchanged glances. One of them, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, spat tobacco juice onto the ground and muttered something that made the others chuckle. The leader raised his hand again, silencing them. "We heard there might be work in these parts. Harvest season coming and all. Thought maybe you could use some extra hands." Thomas knew the harvest lie for what it was. It was only June. Wheat wouldn't be ready for cutting until late July at the earliest. These men weren't looking for honest work. They were sizing up his farm, his defenses, what might be worth taking. From upstairs came Mary Beth's frightened voice, so low Thomas almost didn't hear it. "Mr. Blackwood! Out by the north field! Sarah's with someone!" Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he angled himself to see out the side window without exposing his position. There, at the edge of the wheat field, was his daughter's slender figure, her calico dress visible against the golden stalks. Beside her stood a native man, dressed in a mixture of traditional Pawnee clothing and cast-off white man's garments. Thomas recognized him instantly, Eagle Eye, who'd once worked for him during planting season 3 years back. Before tensions with the reservation had escalated, the Pawnee appeared to be urging Sarah toward the cover of the trees beyond the field, away from the approaching riders. Thomas made a swift decision. "Mary Beth, keep your position. If those men make a move toward the house, fire a warning shot." He moved quickly to the back door. Staying low, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Outside, he used the smokehouse for cover, then darted to the equipment shed. From there, he could see Sarah and Eagle Eye more clearly. His daughter's face was pale with fear, but she was moving deliberately, following the Pawnee's guidance. Thomas caught Eagle Eye's attention with a subtle wave, and the native nodded once in acknowledgement. James appeared silently at Thomas's side, his young face tense. "Pa, there's 3 more riders circling around back. They're trying to flank us." Thomas nodded grimly. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Eagle Eye's got Sarah. He's taking her to safety." James's expression flickered with surprise. "The Pawnee? After the raid?" Thomas cut him off with a sharp gesture. "That wasn't Eagle Eye's band. He's Scout Chief Broken Hand's son. They've kept the peace. Now listen careful. I need you to work your way to Miller's place. Bring back help." James started to protest, but Thomas gripped his son's arm. "You're faster on foot through the creek bed than they'll be on horseback. Go now, while they're focused on the house." Reluctance warred with duty on the young man's face, but he finally nodded. "Yes, sir." With practiced stealth, James slipped away, using the irrigation ditch to cover his movement as he headed east toward the Miller homestead. Thomas turned his attention back to the men at his front door. The leader had dismounted and was approaching the porch, his casual stride belied by the hand resting on his holstered revolver. "Looks like nobody's home, boys," he called back to his companions. "Might as well water the horses and see what's in the barn." Thomas knew he had to act. With the men splitting up to surround his property, he'd soon lose any tactical advantage. He needed to control the situation, establish boundaries, make them reconsider the risk. Taking a deep breath, he stepped from behind the equipment shed, rifle raised but not aimed directly at the intruders. "That's far enough," he called, his voice steady and carrying the authority of a man defending his own. "This is private property. State your business properly or move on." The leader turned slowly, a smile spreading beneath his beard. "Well, now there you are. Like I said, just looking for some hospitality." Thomas kept his expression neutral, years of poker games in Texas saloons serving him well. "Hospitality is offered, not taken. You and your men can water your horses at the creek and then be on your way." The bearded man's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "That's not very neighborly. I heard folks out here were more welcoming." Behind him, the other riders had spread out in a loose semicircle, their hands near their weapons. Thomas could feel their eyes assessing the farm, looking for valuables, for weaknesses. "You heard wrong," Thomas replied. "Nebraska folks respect boundaries. Now I've got work to do, and you've got somewhere else to be." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the distant call of a meadowlark. Thomas was acutely aware of Mary Beth upstairs with the shotgun, of Sarah hopefully reaching safety with eagle eye, of James making his way to Miller's farm. He needed to keep these men talking, keep them contained until help could arrive, or until nightfall provided better cover for a more aggressive defense. The leader seemed to be taking Thomas's measure, his eyes narrowing as he noted the way the farmer held his rifle, not with the awkward grip of a man who used it rarely, but with the comfortable familiarity of someone who considered it an extension of himself. "You've got a nice spread here," the man said finally. "Must be hard working it alone. I don't see many field hands around." It was a fishing expedition, Thomas knew, trying to determine how many people were on the property. How many guns might be defending it? "I manage," Thomas replied simply. "My son and I do the heavy work, got neighbors who help with harvest." He deliberately mentioned his son, but kept the information vague, letting them wonder about numbers and whereabouts. The bearded man nodded slowly. "A son. Good to have family in these parts. My name's Garrett, by the way, John Garrett. I served with the 3rd Missouri during the late unpleasantness." Thomas didn't offer his own name in return, nor did he acknowledge Garrett's claimed military service. The war had taught him that some of the most dangerous men wrapped themselves in the respectability of former rank and uniform. "If you're headed to Redemption Creek," Thomas said instead, "you've overshot by a fair piece. Town's southeast, not north, unless you're actually headed to the reservation." He emphasized the last word slightly, watching for reaction. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps or annoyance, crossed Garrett's face. "Now why would we be headed there? Nothing at that reservation worth a white man's time." One of the other riders, a lanky man with a puckered scar running down his neck, laughed harshly. "Except maybe some horses that ain't guarded too well." Thomas kept his expression carefully neutral, though the comment confirmed his suspicions. These men were likely the ones who'd been raiding isolated farms and stealing from the reservation, blamed on hostile Indians to cover their tracks and inflame tensions. The territory newspapers had carried stories of such incidents for months now. "Reservations under federal protection," Thomas said evenly. "Army patrol comes through regular. Captain Wallace doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." Garrett's eyes narrowed at the mention of the Army patrol, and Thomas knew he'd struck a nerve. Whether these men had already had run-ins with Captain Wallace, or were simply wary of military intervention, the information had clearly given them pause. "We're just passing through," Garrett said, his tone less confident than before. "Looking for honest work, like I said." Thomas didn't bother calling out the lie. Instead, he shifted position slightly, making sure he could see both Garrett and the men who'd been circling toward the back of the property. "Then I suggest you pass through a bit quicker. Redemption Creek's got a new sawmill opening up. They might need men there." It was a deliberate redirection, pointing them toward the more populated town where the sheriff and his deputies could deal with them. For a moment it seemed Garrett might take the suggestion, his posture relaxing slightly as he glanced at his companions. Then the crack of a twig from the direction of the wheat field drew everyone's attention. Thomas's heart sank as he saw Eagle Eye and Sarah frozen at the edge of the field, having apparently doubled back for some reason, instead of continuing to the safety of the trees. "Well, well," drawled Garrett, his hand dropping to his revolver. "Looks like you've got some interesting company, farmer." Thomas's mind raced. Eagle Eye must have encountered the 3 riders James had spotted circling around back and been forced to change course. Now both the Pawnee and Sarah were exposed. Vulnerable. "That's my daughter," Thomas said, keeping his voice level despite the fear clutching at his throat. "And a field hand. They're checking the irrigation ditches." Garrett's smile turned predatory. "That's so. Funny-looking field hand you've got. Thought most of the Pawnee were corralled up on that reservation you mentioned." The men exchanged meaningful glances, and Thomas could see the situation balancing on a knife's edge. If these were indeed the raiders responsible for the attacks on both farms and the reservation, they wouldn't want witnesses who could identify them. The risk to Sarah and Eagle Eye, and to himself, had just increased exponentially. Thomas made a quick decision. "Sarah," he called, his voice firm and carrying across the field, "come on to the house now. Bring Eagle Eye. We've got guests." He emphasized the last word, hoping his daughter would understand the warning it contained. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding, her young face composed despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Eagle Eye moved slightly ahead of her, his posture protective as they began walking slowly toward the farmhouse. Thomas kept his rifle ready, but not aimed, his gaze shifting between Garrett, the approaching pair, and the men still mounted on their horses. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Friendly with the natives, are you?" Garrett asked, his tone conversational but his eyes hard as flint. "Some folks might consider that suspicious." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I consider it practical. Eagle Eye knows this land better than any white man. Helps me predict the weather, manage the crops. His people were farming this valley while our grandfathers were still figuring out which end of a plow to hold. The subtle reminder that the Pawnee were a farming tribe, not the nomadic warriors of the plains that white settlers often feared, was deliberate. Thomas was establishing Eagle Eye as a known quantity, a legitimate presence, making it harder for Garrett to frame any violence as justified. Garrett's jaw tightened beneath his beard. Indians are Indians. Can't trust any of them, friendly or not. As Sarah and Eagle Eye drew closer, Thomas could see his daughter's hands were trembling, though she kept her chin up, just as her mother had taught her before consumption had taken her 5 winters ago. Eagle Eye's face was impassive, but his eyes were alert, constantly scanning the mounted men, measuring distances, noting weapons. When they reached Thomas's side, he spoke without taking his eyes off Garrett. "Sarah, go inside to Mary Beth." His daughter hesitated. "But Pa—" "Now, Sarah." His tone brooked no argument, and she slipped past him toward the porch, casting one frightened glance at the strangers before disappearing into the house. Eagle Eye remained beside Thomas, his presence a silent statement. Garrett's gaze followed Sarah until she was inside, then returned to Thomas with a calculating look. "Pretty girl. Might want to be careful who you let around her." The threat was thinly veiled, and Thomas felt a cold rage building inside him. "I am," he replied, his meaning equally clear. "That's why I'm asking you and your men to move on." Now, the standoff continued, neither man willing to back down, the prairie sun beating down on them all with indifferent cruelty. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, until one of the mounted men called out, "Riders coming, Garrett," from the east. Thomas didn't allow himself the luxury of relief. Miller's farm was east, but it was too soon for James to have reached it and returned with help. These must be different riders altogether. Garrett turned slightly, keeping Thomas in his peripheral vision as he squinted toward the dust cloud on the horizon. His expression darkened. "Blue coats," he muttered. "Army patrol." Now, Thomas did feel a flicker of hope. Captain Wallace's patrols usually consisted of at least 6 men, all well-armed and disciplined. If they were approaching from the east, they must have been returning from Redemption Creek to the reservation, following the main trail that passed within a mile of Thomas's farm. Garrett turned back to his men. "Mount up! We're moving on!" The raiders needed no further instruction, clearly recognizing the threat the army patrol represented. As they swung into their saddles, Garrett fixed Thomas with a hard stare. "This isn't finished, farmer. Territory's a big place. Lots of accidents happen to folks who don't mind their own business." Thomas met his gaze unflinchingly. "I always mind my business, Garrett. My business is my family and my land. Remember that." Eagle Eye remained silent beside him, but his presence seemed to irritate Garrett further. The bearded man spat on the ground before turning his horse. "Let's ride, boys. Nothing worth our time here anyway." They galloped away toward the west, dust billowing behind them as they angled away from both the farm and the approaching patrol. Only when they were a good distance away did Thomas lower his rifle slightly, though he kept it ready. "Thank you," he said quietly to Eagle Eye, "for protecting Sarah." The Pawnee nodded once. "Little Fox is brave." Like her father, he used the name he had given Sarah years ago, when she was just a child playing in the fields while he helped with the planting. But the men who come, they are bad men. They attack our village 3 nights ago, take horses, burn lodges, kill 2 moons, an elder. Thomas's suspicions were confirmed. "The same men hit my storage shed 2 months back, took horses too." Eagle Eye's dark eyes followed the distant riders. "They wear war paint like Sioux sometimes, other times like Pawnee. They want whites and Pawnee to fight, while they take from both." Thomas nodded grimly. It was an old tactic, stirring up trouble between settlers and natives to cover criminal activities. With tensions already high in the territory, it was an effective distraction. The approaching patrol was now close enough that Thomas could make out individual riders. At their head was the familiar figure of Captain Daniel Wallace, his straight-backed military posture unmistakable even at a distance. "The captain will want to know about this," Thomas said. "Will you speak with him?" Many of the Pawnee avoided direct interaction with the army when possible, preferring to deal through their official tribal representatives. But Eagle Eye nodded. "I will speak. Captain Wallace knows my father. He is fair man, and for a blue coat." It was high praise from a Pawnee. Captain Wallace had earned a reputation for dealing honestly with the tribes under his jurisdiction, a rarity among frontier officers. The patrol slowed as they approached the farm, clearly having spotted Thomas and Eagle Eye standing in the yard. Inside the farmhouse, Mary Beth watched from the upstairs window, the shotgun still clutched in her hands. When she saw the army patrol approaching, she called down to Sarah, who had taken position by the front door with an old Colt revolver of her father's. "It's the soldiers, Sarah, Captain Wallace's men." Sarah's relief was visible even from upstairs. "Is Pa all right? And Eagle Eye?" Mary Beth nodded, though her own heart was still racing from the confrontation. "They're both fine. Those other men are riding away west." She set the shotgun aside and smoothed her hair, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after the tension of the past hour. "I should put on some coffee. The captain and his men will likely want refreshment." Sarah nodded, holstering the Colt in the belt at her waist, a most unladylike accessory that nonetheless seemed perfectly natural on Thomas Blackwood's daughter. "I'll fetch the good cups," she said, her young voice steadier now, "and see if there's any of that blackberry preserves left." The domestic preparations were a comfort, a return to normality after the threat of violence had hung over the farm like a storm cloud. Outside, Captain Wallace reined in his horse and dismounted with the fluid grace of a career cavalryman. At 45, he was still fit and strong, despite the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair and moustache. "Blackwood," he greeted Thomas with a nod. "Eagle Eye. Wasn't expecting to find you two together." There was no censure in his tone, merely observation. Unlike many army officers, Wallace recognized the practical alliances that often formed between settlers and natives on the frontier, regardless of official policies. "Had some unwelcome visitors," Thomas explained, gesturing toward the dust cloud still visible on the western horizon. "Called themselves travelers looking for work. But they had theft and worse on their minds." Wallace's expression hardened. "Description." Thomas provided it quickly. 8 men, led by one calling himself John Garrett, claiming to be ex-Confederate cavalry, all well-armed and mounted on good horses. Eagle Eye added details about the raids on the Pawnee village, including the distinctive markings one of the raiders had on his saddle, a brass plate with a 5-pointed star that had once likely belonged to a Texas Ranger. Wallace listened intently, occasionally nodding to his sergeant to make notes. When they finished, he stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Sounds like the same bunch we've been tracking. They hit a stagecoach near Fort Kearney last month, killed the driver and a passenger. Been moving west since, staying just ahead of us." He turned to Eagle Eye. "Chief Broken Hand sent word about the raid on your village. We were headed there next." Eagle Eye nodded. "My father will welcome you. He knows you seek justice for all people, not just whites." It was a significant statement from a Pawnee, especially given the history of broken promises and mistreatment the tribes had endured. Wallace acknowledged it with a respectful nod before turning back to Thomas. "Where's your boy, James, isn't it?" Thomas explained about sending James to Miller's farm for help. "He should be back before nightfall, assuming old Jebediah doesn't talk his ear off first." The captain smiled briefly at that. Jebediah Miller's loquaciousness was legendary in the territory. "Good lad." Thinking on his feet, "You've raised him well, Blackwood." The farmhouse door opened, and Sarah stepped onto the porch. "Pa, Mary Beth's put coffee on, and there's cold buttermilk if the men prefer." She had changed into a clean dress and pinned her hair, transforming from the frightened girl at the edge of the wheat field to a poised young hostess. Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with a familiar ache. She looked more like her mother every day. "Thank you, Sarah. Please tell Mary Beth the captain and his men would be obliged." Wallace tipped his hat to Sarah. "Miss Blackwood, you're growing into quite the young lady." Sarah blushed slightly, but maintained her composure. "Thank you, Captain. You and your men are always welcome at our table." As the soldiers dismounted and loosened their horses' saddle girths, Thomas led Wallace and Eagle Eye toward the house. The immediate danger had passed, but Thomas knew the raiders would not give up so easily. Garrett had seemed too determined, too confident. There was more to this than random theft and troublemaking, and until James returned with help from the neighbors or until the army patrol moved on, his farm remained vulnerable. Inside, Mary Beth had laid out her best efforts. A pot of strong coffee, fresh buttermilk, cornbread made that morning, and the last of the blackberry preserves from the previous summer's harvest. The small dining table couldn't accommodate all of Wallace's men, so they took turns coming in from the porch, 2 at a time, while the others kept watch. Eagle Eye initially hesitated at the threshold. Many white households would not welcome a Pawnee at their table, but Thomas gestured him in with a firm nod. "You risked your life for my daughter today. That makes you family as far as I'm concerned." Wallace observed the interaction with approval. In his years on the frontier, he'd seen how individual acts of decency could build bridges where official policies failed. As they settled around the table, Wallace unfolded a map of the territory. "These raiders have been working their way west for months. They started near the Missouri border, hit farms and small settlements as they moved." His finger traced their path across the map. "They're careful. Never hit the same area twice. Always make it look like Indian trouble when they can. Eagle Eye studied the map intently. They know the land well. Move between white settlements and Indian lands. Use the rivers, the high ground. His finger pointed to several locations. Here, here, and here, places where Pawnee were blamed for raids on white farms. But those times, our people were at the agency collecting monthly goods. Wallace nodded. That's been their strategy. Keep everyone suspicious of each other while they profit. Thomas leaned forward, examining the pattern. They're following the planned railroad route, he said suddenly, seeing what hadn't been obvious before. Every raid has been within 10 miles of where the Union Pacific is surveying for the new spur line. The captain's eyebrows rose. You're right, Blackwood. I hadn't put that together. He studied the map with renewed interest. The question is, are they just taking advantage of the increased traffic and attention the railroad survey brings, or is there something more deliberate going on? Thomas remembered something he'd overheard in Redemption Creek's general store 2 weeks earlier. There's been land speculation all along the proposed route, prices tripling for parcels that might end up with a depot or water stop. Wallace's expression turned grim. Land speculation can turn ugly fast. If someone's trying to drive settlers and Indians off valuable parcels, he didn't need to finish the thought. All of them had seen how ruthless men could become when railroad money was involved. The raids, the manufactured tensions between settlers and natives, it was a familiar pattern, but no less effective for its predictability. Your farm sits on a natural plateau, Wallace noted, pointing to Thomas's location on the map. Good water access, clear sight lines, prime location for a depot or watering station. The implication was clear. Thomas's land might be more valuable to the railroad than just another wheat farm, which would make it a target for speculators willing to use violence to secure property cheaply. Mary Beth, who had been quietly serving coffee, spoke up unexpectedly. 2 men came by last month, said they represented Eastern investors, offered to buy the farm for 3 times what Mr. Blackwood paid for it. Thomas nodded, remembering the encounter. I turned them down flat. This land isn't for sale at any price. The captain's expression was troubled. Did they leave names or say who they represented? Thomas shook his head. Said they were from Chicago, but their accents were pure Missouri, like that Garrett fellow today. Left a letter with an offer, though I didn't bother reading it through before tossing it in the stove. Sarah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Pa, one of them had a scar right here. She drew her finger from the corner of her eye down her cheek. I remember because he caught me looking at it and winked at me. Made my skin crawl. Wallace exchanged a significant glance with his sergeant. Mitchell had a scar like that, one of the men who robbed the stage at Fort Kearney. Eagle Eye's expression darkened. The same man was at our village during the raid. I saw him take Chief Broken Hand's ceremonial pipe, a sacred thing. The connections were becoming clearer. The land speculators, the raiders, the efforts to drive both settlers and Pawnee from their lands, all pieces of the same scheme, and Thomas's farm, it seemed, was one of their primary targets. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Thomas moved quickly to the window, rifle ready, but relaxed when he recognized James riding alongside Jebediah Miller and 4 other neighboring farmers. James is back with the neighbors, he announced, setting his rifle aside and moving to the door. Wallace followed, adjusting his uniform jacket as he stepped onto the porch. The arrival of armed neighbors changed the tactical situation. Thomas's farm was now well defended enough that the raiders would be unlikely to return immediately, but it also complicated the captain's authority. Civilian posses were officially discouraged by the army, even as they remained a frontier necessity. James dismounted quickly, his young face flushed with exertion and pride at having successfully completed his mission. Pa, I got Mr. Miller and the others. Mr. Jensen brought his sons too. They're coming along behind with the wagon. Thomas clasped his son's shoulder. Well done, James. Captain Wallace and his patrol are here too. James straightened, suddenly conscious of the military presence. "Captain," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. Jebediah Miller, a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War who'd homesteaded in Nebraska since before the Civil War, dismounted more slowly, his 60-year-old joints protesting the quick ride. "Blackwood," he greeted Thomas. "Your boy said you had trouble." "Raiders?" Thomas nodded. "8 of them, led by a man calling himself Garrett. Same bunch that hit my storage shed before and the Pawnee village 3 nights ago." Miller's weathered face hardened. "Bastards! Begging your pardon, Miss Sarah," he added with a nod to Thomas's daughter. "They burned out the Wilkinsons last week, 10 miles west of my place. Poor folks barely got out with their lives." This was news to Thomas, and apparently to Wallace as well. The captain stepped forward. "The Wilkinsons?" "Jacob and Martha. They reported Indian raiders." Miller spat into the dust. "Weren't no Indians. Martha Wilkinson told my Agnes she saw white men painting their faces like Indians. One of them had a big beard like Satan himself," she said. Thomas and Wallace exchanged glances. That description matched Garrett perfectly. "We need to compare notes, gentlemen," Wallace said decisively. "It seems these raiders have been more active than even my patrols were aware." The group moved inside, where Mary Beth hastily arranged more seating, as the neighboring farmers crowded into Thomas's modest front room. Eagle Eye remained slightly apart, though Thomas made a point of including him in the circle, aware that the Pawnee's knowledge would be crucial. For the next hour, they shared information. Each farm attack, each reported sighting, each rumor from town. A pattern emerged, more coherent than before. The raiders were systematically targeting properties along the proposed railroad route, especially those at potential depot locations. They alternated between posing as Indians to attack white settlers and posing as army deserters to raid native villages, deliberately inflaming tensions between the communities. "It's land speculation, pure and simple," concluded Wallace grimly. "Drive people off their land. Buy it cheap from those desperate to leave. Sell it dear to the railroad once the route is confirmed." Miller nodded in agreement. The bank in Redemption Creek foreclosed on the Peterson place after they got raided. Very next day, some fella from St. Louis bought it for pennies on the dollar. Thomas remembered Peterson, a hard-working Swedish immigrant who'd lost everything, including his youngest son, in a raid attributed to hostile Pawnee. Eagle Eye had been silent during much of the discussion, but now he spoke, his voice carrying quiet authority. "My father says the white man's railroad brings change like winter blizzard. Cannot stop it, can only prepare. But these raiders, they are like wolves who attack both our camps, hoping we will blame each other while they grow fat." The simple wisdom of the analogy struck Thomas forcefully. He had no objection to the railroad itself. Progress was inevitable, and the connecting line would bring better prices for his wheat and more opportunities for James and Sarah. What he opposed was the corruption that so often accompanied such progress, the willingness of men to destroy lives for profit. Wallace stood, decision made. "We need to stop these raiders before they cause a full-scale conflict between settlers and the Pawnee. That means working together, Army, settlers, and Pawnee scouts." He looked at Eagle Eye. "Will Chief Broken Hand agree to provide scouts?" Eagle Eye considered this, then nodded slowly. "For this purpose, yes. These raiders threaten all our people." The afternoon stretched into evening as they formulated a plan. The raiders seemed to be working their way systematically along the proposed rail line. Based on the pattern of attacks, Wallace believed their next targets would be either the Hanson farm to the west or the Pawnee hunting camp near Beaver Creek. "We can't defend every possible target," the captain acknowledged, "but we can set a trap." Thomas studied the map, an idea forming. "My farm sits between those 2 locations. If we make it look vulnerable, like I've taken my family and fled after today's confrontation, they might decide to hit it next." Wallace considered this. "It's risky, Blackwood. These men don't hesitate to burn homesteads to the ground." Thomas nodded grimly. "I know the risk, but my family will be safe at Miller's place, and this farm has to be defended sometime." Might as well be on our terms with proper preparation. The captain studied Thomas's face, recognizing the determination there. All right, we'll use your farm as bait, but we do this by the book. No vigilante justice. These men will face proper trial in Redemption Creek. As night fell, the details were finalized. Mary Beth and Sarah would go with James to Miller's farm, where Jebediah's wife Agnes would look after them. Thomas, Wallace, and a combined force of soldiers and neighboring farmers would prepare an ambush at the Blackwood farm. Eagle Eye would return to his village to brief Chief Broken Hand and bring back Pawnee scouts to watch the trails and provide early warning of the raiders' approach. It was a solid plan. Though all of them knew that even the best plans rarely survived a first contact with the enemy. As the others departed to make their preparations, Thomas stood on his porch watching the sun set over his wheat fields. The golden stalks had taken on a reddish hue in the dying light, like a sea of blood. The thought was unsettling, but Thomas pushed it aside. This land was worth fighting for, not just the physical property, but what it represented. A place where his children could build their futures, where people of different backgrounds could work together despite their differences, where honest labor meant something. Mary Beth appeared beside him, her face illuminated by the lantern she carried. "Everything's packed, Mr. Blackwood. Sarah's just gathering her mother's locket and Bible." Thomas nodded, grateful for her efficiency and calm. "Thank you, Mary Beth. I know this isn't what you expected when you answered my advertisement for a housekeeper." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "No, it certainly isn't. In Boston, the greatest danger was gossip at the church social." Her expression grew serious again. "But I don't regret coming west. Despite everything, there's a realness to life here that I never found back east." Thomas understood what she meant. The frontier stripped away pretensions, forced people to confront who they truly were beneath the veneer of civilization. Some broke under that pressure. Others, like Mary Beth, revealed unexpected strength. "You've been good for Sarah," he said quietly. "She needed a woman's influence these past years. Her mother would be grateful." Mary Beth's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "She's a remarkable girl. She'll make a fine woman someday if these troubles don't—" She stopped herself, but Thomas knew what she'd been about to say. "If these troubles don't get her killed first." Inside, Sarah was carefully wrapping her mother's Bible in a soft cloth, the gold locket containing a lock of her mother's hair already secured around her neck. At 14, she stood at the threshold between childhood and womanhood, her movements betraying that awkward grace of adolescence. James entered the room, rifle in hand, his young face serious with responsibility. "The wagon's ready, Sarah. Mr. Miller says we need to leave now to reach his place before full dark." Sarah nodded, placing the wrapped Bible in her small carpet bag. "I'm ready." She glanced around the room, her parents' room, where she'd been born, where her mother had died, where so many family prayers and tears and joys had been shared. "We will come back, won't we, James?" Her brother's expression softened slightly. "Course we will, Squirt. Pa won't let those raiders take our home. Neither will I." Sarah managed a small smile at the childhood nickname she usually protested. Tonight, it was a comfort, a reminder of simpler times. Together, they descended to the main room where Thomas and Mary Beth waited. Captain Wallace had already departed with his men to make preparations, leaving Thomas alone with his family for these final moments. Thomas embraced each of them, James with a firm clasp and words of pride, Sarah with a gentle kiss on the forehead and a promise of return, Mary Beth with a respectful nod that nonetheless conveyed his trust in her care of his children. "Stay close to Miller's house," he instructed. "Jebediah's boys will keep watch, but if there's any sign of trouble, you head for the root cellar. It's stocked and secure." They nodded, the gravity of the situation reflected in their solemn faces. As they climbed into the wagon, James at the reins, Mary Beth and Sarah seated behind with their small bundles of possessions, Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every decision, every action had consequences that rippled outward, affecting not just his family, but the entire community. The wagon pulled away, James guiding the team with steady hands despite his youth. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the gathering darkness, then turned back to his empty house. Now the waiting began, the hardest part of any battle. Dawn broke over the Blackwood farm with a crimson streak across the eastern sky. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning, as the old saying went. Thomas, who had slept little during the night, took it as an appropriate omen for the day ahead. Captain Wallace and his men had concealed themselves well, some in the barn, others in the root cellar, still others in the thick stands of cottonwoods by the creek. The neighboring farmers who had volunteered to help had been similarly distributed around the property, each with clear fields of fire and strict instructions to wait for Wallace's signal before engaging. Thomas himself had taken position in the house, at the upstairs window that offered the best view of the approach from the west. The farm had been carefully staged to appear hastily abandoned, the front door left ajar, the chicken coop empty, the birds temporarily relocated to a makeshift pen behind the barn, a wagon gone from its usual place. Only thin wisps of smoke from the kitchen chimney suggested habitation, and that was part of the plan. A single man might remain behind to secure valuables before following his family to safety. Eagle Eye had departed the previous evening, slipping away like a shadow to bring word to his father and gather the Pawnee scouts who would watch the trails. Thomas trusted him completely, a trust built over years of fair dealings and mutual respect. Not all settlers shared Thomas's views on the native peoples. Many saw them only as obstacles to progress or threats to security. But he had learned early in his frontier life that alliances based on honor benefited everyone. The sound of approaching riders came shortly after 9 in the morning, not from the west as expected, but from the north. Thomas tensed, adjusting his position to see the new approach. Through his field glasses, he counted 6 men, not 8. Either Garrett had split his force, or 2 had departed for other business. The riders approached cautiously, circling the property at a distance before drawing closer. Thomas recognized Garrett's distinctive cavalry hat and full beard, as well as the pockmarked face of one of his lieutenants. They were being careful, which suggested they suspected a trap. That made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. They would test the waters before committing fully. A bird call sounded from the cottonwoods, Wallace's signal that his men had spotted the approach and were ready. Thomas acknowledged with a similar call, then settled in to wait. Garrett and 2 others dismounted at the edge of the farmyard, leaving the remaining 3 with the horses. They approached the house slowly, weapons drawn but not raised. Thomas could hear Garrett's voice clearly through the open window. "Looks like our farmer friend took our advice and cleared out." The pockmarked man laughed unpleasantly. "Left in a hurry, too, probably pissing himself all the way to town." The third man, younger than the others with a shock of red hair visible beneath his hat, seemed less certain. "I don't like it, Garrett. Why is there still smoke from the chimney? And where are the chickens? No settler leaves chickens behind, not even in a panic." Thomas silently commended the young outlaw's observational skills, even as he tightened his grip on his rifle. Garrett paused, considering. Maybe someone stayed behind, or came back. He raised his voice. "Hello, the house? Anybody home?" Thomas remained silent, part of the agreed strategy. Let them come closer. Let them commit to entering the property fully before springing the trap. Garrett waited, then turned to his men. "Mitchell, check the barn. Jenkins, circle around back. I'll take the house." As they separated, Thomas made eye contact with Wallace, who had positioned himself at the edge of the cottonwoods with a clear view of the yard. The captain held up a closed fist. Wait. The moment was delicate. If they sprang the trap too soon, some of the raiders might escape. If they waited too long, the raiders might discover one of the hiding places and turn the tables. Garrett approached the front door, revolver drawn, his movements betraying his military background in their precision and economy. He paused at the threshold. Listening, then pushed the door open wider with the barrel of his gun. Thomas aimed carefully, but held his fire, following Wallace's plan. Let Garrett commit fully, draw the others in. The bearded man took one step into the house, then another. From Thomas's position upstairs, he could see the top of Garrett's head as the raider moved into the front room. Suddenly a shout came from the direction of the barn. "Garrett, it's a trap! Soldiers in the—" The crack of a rifle shot cut off the warning as one of Wallace's men fired, forced to reveal his position prematurely. The careful plan dissolved into chaos in an instant. Garrett spun and bolted from the house, surprisingly fast for his size. Thomas fired but missed as the raider zigzagged across the yard. Wallace's signal, 3 rapid shots rang out, and the entire farm erupted in gunfire. Raiders and defenders exchanged shots from multiple positions, dust and splinters flying as bullets found wood instead of flesh. Thomas raced downstairs, knowing the house was now a target rather than a vantage point. He barely made it to the kitchen door when a bullet shattered the front window, showering the room with glass. Outside, he could see Wallace directing his men from the cover of the cottonwoods, while 2 of the neighboring farmers provided covering fire from behind the well. One of the raiders was already down, clutching a bleeding leg, while another had taken cover behind the overturned water trough. Garrett himself had reached his horse and was mounting up, shouting orders to his remaining men. "Fall back! Head for the high ground!" Thomas took careful aim and fired, his bullet grazing the raider's shoulder but not stopping him. Garrett wheeled his horse and galloped north, 2 of his men following close behind. The remaining raiders were pinned down, outgunned, and outpositioned. Within minutes, Wallace's men had them surrounded. "Throw down your weapons," the captain commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of the United States Army. "You're surrounded with no chance of escape." For a tense moment, it seemed the raiders might choose to fight to the death. Then, one by one, they dropped their guns and raised their hands. The young red-headed one was last, his face a mask of defiance and fear. "Garrett will come back for us," he called out, even as soldiers moved in to secure him. "He doesn't abandon his men." Wallace approached, holstering his revolver. "Garrett just abandoned you, son. And where you're going, he won't be able to help you even if he wanted to." Thomas surveyed the aftermath with a mixture of relief and concern. The immediate threat had been neutralized. 3 raiders captured, 1 wounded too severely to flee, but Garrett and 2 others had escaped. His farm had sustained damage, broken windows, bullet holes in the barn siding, the water trough destroyed, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. No defenders had been killed, though one of Miller's nephews had taken a bullet in the arm and was being tended by the patrol's medic. The real concern was Garrett. The leader had escaped, and men like him rarely surrendered or gave up. He would regroup, perhaps recruit new men, and continue his campaign of terror. And now he had a personal grudge against Thomas Blackwood and his farm. Wallace seemed to read Thomas's thoughts. "We'll post 2 men here until we catch Garrett," he said, joining Thomas by the damaged porch. "And I'll send word to Fort Kearney for reinforcements. This has gone beyond a local matter. It's organized crime threatening the entire territory." Thomas nodded his thanks. "What about the captives? Think they'll talk?" Wallace glanced toward the 3 raiders, now sitting disarmed under guard near the barn. "The young one might. He doesn't have the hardened look of the others. And with charges of murder, land fraud, and attacks on federal property, the reservation, hanging over them, they're facing the noose, unless they cooperate." It was frontier justice, harsh but necessary in a land where law was still being established. Thomas didn't envy Wallace the task of balancing military authority with civilian jurisdiction, especially when the crimes crossed so many boundaries. A rider approached from the east, one of the Pawnee scouts Eagle Eye had promised. He spoke rapidly to Wallace's translator, who then turned to the captain. "Sir, the scout reports Garrett and his men were joined by 3 others about 2 miles north. They're heading for the Beaver Creek crossing." Wallace's expression hardened. "That's the direction of the Pawnee hunting camp." The implications were clear. Garrett, having failed at the Blackwood farm, was turning his attention to a softer target. "I need to warn them," Thomas said, already moving toward the barn where his horse was stabled. Wallace didn't try to stop him. The captain understood frontier realities. Sometimes official channels moved too slowly, and lives depended on direct action. "Take 4 of my men with you," Wallace ordered. "I'll follow with the rest as soon as we secure the prisoners." Thomas nodded gratefully. He had no illusions about facing Garrett and 5 men alone. As he saddled his horse, he found himself joined by the young soldier who served as Wallace's translator, a lieutenant named Parker, who had grown up near a Pawnee settlement and spoke their language fluently. "Captain says I'm to accompany you, sir," Parker said, his manner respectful despite Thomas's civilian status. "I know the hunting camp location." 3 more soldiers joined them, all mounted and armed with cavalry carbines. Within minutes, they were galloping north toward Beaver Creek, following the Pawnee scout who had brought the warning. Thomas could only hope they would arrive in time. The hunting camp lay in a sheltered valley along Beaver Creek, where the Pawnee had established a temporary village of hide tippies for the summer hunting season. Women worked outside the lodges, preparing hides and smoking meat, while children played along the creek banks under the watchful eyes of elders. It was a scene of peaceful industry, far removed from the stereotypes of savage Indians that populated dime novels and newspaper accounts back east. As Thomas and the soldiers approached, they were met by mounted Pawnee warriors who had been posted as sentries. Lieutenant Parker called out a greeting in their language, explaining their urgent purpose. The warriors escorted them into the camp, where Chief Broken Hand awaited, alerted to their arrival by faster riders. The chief was an imposing figure despite his 60 years, tall and straight-backed, with deeply lined features that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. Beside him stood Eagle Eye, who stepped forward to translate when he saw Thomas. "My father welcomes Thomas Blackwood and the Blue Coat soldiers," Eagle Eye said formally. "He asks why you ride so hard to our camp." Thomas dismounted, showing proper respect by approaching on foot. "Danger comes. Chief Broken Hand, the raiders who attacked your village 3 nights ago, they ride this way now, 8 men, led by the one with the big beard." As Eagle Eye translated, murmurs spread through the gathering crowd of Pawnee. Broken Hand's expression remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. When he spoke, his voice was measured and dignified. "We thank you for this warning, Thomas Blackwood. The Pawnee do not forget those who ride to help our people." He turned to his warriors, issuing rapid commands. The camp burst into activity, women gathering children and essential supplies, warriors checking weapons, young men moving horses to protected positions. Thomas was impressed by their efficiency and calm. There was no panic, only purposeful preparation. Broken Hand turned back to Thomas and the soldiers. "How many come? When will they arrive?" Lieutenant Parker stepped forward, explaining what they knew about Garrett's group and their likely approach. The chief listened intently, then nodded. "We will not run," he declared firmly. "Too many times we have been forced to leave our lands. Today we stand." He gestured toward the creek and the rocky ridges that bordered the valley. "The land here favors defense. We know every stone, every tree. The raiders do not." It was sound, tactical thinking. Rather than attempting to evacuate the camp, a process that would leave them vulnerable on the trail, Broken Hand was choosing to make a stand on ground of his own choosing, with the knowledge of the terrain as his advantage. Thomas respected the decision, even as he worried about the women and children. As if reading his thoughts, Broken Hand added, "The young ones and mothers will take shelter in the caves behind the waterfall. Our warriors and your soldiers will meet these raiders before they reach the camp." Within an hour, their defenses were in place. The Pawnee warriors, numbering about 20 able fighters, had taken positions along the ridgelines and behind the natural cover of boulders and trees. Lieutenant Parker and his 3 soldiers were similarly positioned to provide covering fire with their longer-range carbines. Thomas found himself beside Eagle Eye and 2 other Pawnee hunters, watching the northern approach where the valley narrowed between two steep hills. The waiting was tense, each minute stretching as they strained for any sign of the approaching raiders. "Your father is a wise leader," Thomas said quietly to Eagle Eye. "Many would have chosen to flee." Eagle Eye nodded, his eyes never leaving the trail ahead. "My father says the whites and the Pawnee are like the creek and the land. Sometimes at war, sometimes at peace, but always connected. What happens to one affects the other." It was a profound observation, one that Thomas wished more settlers and more government officials could understand. The attack, when it came, was not the frontal assault they had expected. Garrett had indeed learned caution from his earlier defeat. The first sign of trouble was a thin plume of smoke rising from the eastern edge of the camp, a diversion meant to draw defenders away from their positions. Thomas wasn't fooled, nor was Broken Hand, who kept his warriors in place while sending only a small party to deal with the fire. The real attack came from the west, where the creek bend created a blind spot in their defenses. 3 raiders, including Garrett himself, attempted to infiltrate the camp by wading through the shallow water, using the bank as cover. They might have succeeded if not for the vigilance of an old Pawnee woman who had remained behind to guard the food stores. Her warning cry alerted the nearest warriors, who swiftly moved to intercept. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the valley as the raiders found themselves caught in the open, their surprise advantage lost. The remaining raiders, hearing the shots, launched their own attack from the north, likely hoping to draw attention from their comrades' predicament. They rode hard toward the valley entrance, where Thomas and Eagle Eye were positioned, firing as they came. Thomas took careful aim with his Winchester, dropping one raider from his saddle with a shot to the shoulder. Eagle Eye's arrow found another, piercing the man's thigh and causing him to veer off course. The 3rd and 4th raiders split up, seeking cover among the rocks and trees. Lieutenant Parker's carbine cracked from higher ground, the bullet kicking up dust at a raider's feet and forcing him back. The coordinated defense was working, the raiders, expecting to find a vulnerable camp of women and children, had instead ridden into a prepared ambush by determined defenders who knew the terrain intimately. In the camp itself, Garrett and his 2 men were pinned down behind a cluster of boulders, exchanging fire with Pawnee warriors who had them surrounded. Thomas saw one of the raiders break cover and make a desperate run for the trees. 2 arrows and a rifle shot found him before he'd gone 10 paces. He fell, writhed briefly, and lay still. Another raider raised his hands in surrender, throwing his weapon aside. Only Garrett and 2 others continued to resist, their position deteriorating by the minute. "It's over, Garrett," Thomas called out, having worked his way closer during the firefight. "Throw down your weapons!" The bearded raider's response was a bullet that whistled past Thomas's ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Eagle Eye, who had shadowed Thomas's advance, pointed to a route that would allow them to flank Garrett's position. Together, they moved silently through the underbrush, using the skills Eagle Eye had honed through a lifetime of hunting. They emerged behind the boulder where Garrett had taken his last stand, only to find him preparing to make a final, desperate charge. "Drop it, Garrett," Thomas said, his rifle aimed squarely at the raider's back. "It's finished." Garrett froze, then slowly turned his head. The recognition in his eyes when he saw Thomas was followed by pure hatred. "You," he spat, "the farmer. Should have burned you out when I had the chance." Thomas kept his rifle steady. "Why? For railroad money? Was it worth all the lives you've taken?" Something flickered across Garrett's face. Not remorse, but perhaps a recognition of futility. "You don't understand, farmer. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Men like me just help clear the path." It was the cold calculation of a man who viewed people as obstacles, progress as inevitable, and himself as merely an instrument of change. "The railroad doesn't need your kind of help," Thomas replied. "It needs honest men building honest futures." Garrett's laugh was bitter. "Honest men finish last in this territory. Always have." With surprising speed, he swung his revolver toward Thomas. Eagle Eye's arrow took him in the chest before he could fire, driving him backward against the boulder. The fight drained from him visibly, his weapon dropping from nerveless fingers as he slid to the ground. Captain Wallace arrived with reinforcements an hour later, having secured the prisoners at the Blackwood farm and ridden hard to join the fight. By then, it was largely over. 3 raiders were dead, including Garrett. The others had been captured, disarmed, and bound. Chief Broken Hand's people had suffered only minor injuries, a testament to their preparation and knowledge of the terrain. As Wallace surveyed the aftermath, he nodded approvingly at the cooperation between the Pawnee warriors and his soldiers. "This is how it should be," he said to Thomas and Broken Hand, who stood together watching the prisoners being loaded onto wagons for transport. Different peoples working together against common threats. The chief's weathered face remained impassive, but he inclined his head slightly in agreement. "Today, we fought as allies. Tomorrow." He left the question hanging, both men knowing that the pressures of settlement, railroad expansion, and government policy would continue to test any alliance built on individual actions rather than official recognition. 3 days later, Thomas stood on his porch, watching James and Sarah playing with the chickens in the yard. They had returned from Miller's farm the day after the confrontation, helping Thomas repair the damage to the house and barn. Mary Beth moved about the kitchen, preparing the evening meal, her quiet efficiency a comfort in the aftermath of violence. The farm was returning to its normal rhythms, fields to tend, animals to care for, a family to raise. Yet Thomas knew things had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The territory newspapers were already carrying stories of the Beaver Creek Gang and their defeat through the cooperative efforts of the army, settlers, and Pawnee. Some accounts were more accurate than others, but all acknowledged the unusual alliance that had prevailed against a common threat. Captain Wallace had promised investigations into the land speculation connected to the railroad survey, though Thomas harbored few illusions about justice reaching the powerful men in Chicago and St. Louis who had likely financed Garrett's operation. Eagle Eye and 2 other Pawnee hunters approached from the direction of the creek, carrying several rabbits and a wild turkey, offerings from Chief Broken Hand in thanks for Thomas's warning. It was a gesture that would raise eyebrows among some settlers, but Thomas accepted it with the dignity with which it was offered. "Your father honors my family," he said to Eagle Eye as they sat in the shade of the porch. "Please tell him the Blackwoods consider the Pawnee our friends, regardless of what others may say." Eagle Eye nodded, understanding the significance of such a statement in the current climate of tension and mistrust. "My father says the days ahead will bring many changes. The Iron Horse will come. More white settlers will follow. The old ways must adapt or die." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a clear-eyed assessment of reality. But he also says that when honest men of different peoples stand together, as we did against the raiders, there is hope for a path that brings less suffering. Thomas considered this wisdom as he watched the sun setting over his wheat fields, now nearly ready for harvest. The railroad would indeed come, bringing changes both welcome and difficult. The territory would continue its transformation into settled states, with all the complexity that entailed. But perhaps the events of the past days had demonstrated something important, that cooperation was possible, that differences could be bridged when people recognized their common humanity and common interests. It was a fragile hope in a harsh land, but it was real nonetheless. As Mary Beth called everyone to supper, Thomas held that hope close, like a seed that might, with proper tending, grow into something substantial and lasting. The future of the West would be written by those willing to build rather than destroy, to understand rather than fear, to stand firm for what was right rather than surrender to the temptations of expediency and prejudice. And in that moment, with his family safe and his land secure, Thomas Blackwood resolved to be one of those builders, however small his contribution might seem, against the vast canvas of the changing frontier. Sarah stepped onto the porch, her young face serious. "Pa, Captain Wallace's messenger just rode up. He says the captain wants you to know they caught the last of Garrett's men trying to cross into Dakota territory." Thomas nodded, grateful for the news. It meant one less threat to worry about, one less shadow on the horizon. "Thank you, Sarah. Ask him if he'll stay for supper." His daughter smiled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Already did, Pa. Mary Beth's setting an extra place." Thomas smiled in return, proud of the young woman his daughter was becoming. Thoughtful, resilient, kind, despite the harshness she had witnessed. The West might be wild, but it was also a forge, tempering those who survived its trials into something stronger. As the family gathered around the table, Thomas and his children, Mary Beth with her quiet grace, Eagle Eye and his fellow hunters as honored guests, the farmer offered a simple prayer of thanks, not just for the food before them or the safety they now enjoyed, but for the bonds that had been forged through adversity. In the fading light of day, as the first stars appeared above the Nebraska plains, those bonds seemed to Thomas like the true wealth of the frontier, more valuable than land or gold, more enduring than any railroad that might come. And in that moment, it was enough. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.